Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Andy, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Now, Andy, in preparation for this conversation, I had a look at your website and I found something interesting, which is this. And I'm going to read it almost word for word. I have it here. On your website, I read, okay, Andy is a business networking strategist. That's you are an expert in business networking. Your style of networking is about being an authentic person, and that covers sharing social information as well as professional. He loves music. After growing up listening to The Doors, Hendrix, Lou Reed, and Bowie, today his tastes range from classical to punk with everything in between, except Coldplay. Why is that?
It's very funny. I delivered a virtual presentation about 3 weeks ago, and we got to the Q&A at the end, and the first question was, why do you hate Coldplay? It's not music. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's just a guy straining his voice as if he needs a good laxative. I don't know. It's not music. It's painful.
You don't like it, okay? And you also,
I'll turn the radio over as soon as Coldplay come on. It's just
and you also say in your website that at home he has a passion for cooking, and he claims to make a mean chocolate truffle torte. Is that true?
Yeah, it's not just a claim, it's true. It's quite funny, that's been on my website for a while, and it is sort of my party piece. I gave a talk in Siberia about 4 or 5 years ago, and the organisers saw that on my website, and they had originally arranged for me to make the chocolate truffle torte on TV in Siberia. Sadly, it didn't come about. I think that would have been the highlight of my career had that happened.
Yeah. Okay, so Andy, let's talk about effective presentations and public speaking. That's why we are here. Now, the reason why we are here is because I think I met you, must have been a year ago or something. You spoke at an event organized by the Association of Business Mentors, and you were their guest speaker, and I was impressed by your talk.
Thank you.
And I still remember a number of things from that presentation. And what I like to do is I like to tell you what I've noticed, some of the things I've noticed in that talk, and we're going to have a conversation about those things. For example, one of the main things I noticed was that you used a lot of stories in your presentation. So you wanted to communicate certain messages, but you didn't just communicate your messages, you communicated them through stories. So could you please tell us why you do this when you speak in public? Why is this important?
It's probably presentation skills 101. Stories are integral to any good presentation, whether it's someone else's stories, as you heard predominantly in that presentation, or whether it's your own stories, which actually I'm reworking that presentation at the moment, and in its new iteration it will be more focused on my own journey, because that's what people resonate more with. It helps the listener process the message. It helps put the message into context, and it also helps the listener remember the message effectively. You know, we are brought up on stories as kids. It's how we teach our kids. We teach them through stories. You know, all of the old fairy tales, all the old fables, they're there to carry a message, to teach a lesson. And the vehicle for doing that is stories. And we're no different as adults. You know, we've had that ingrained into us. That's how we learn best, putting it into context. What I'm trying to do when I share a story is paint a picture in the audience's mind of something that happened, so that they can really see the point I'm making in context, and make it more real for them.
And another thing you did connected to this, not only did you tell stories, but I still remember. I don't remember which story, but I remember that you started with a story and then you finished your presentation going back to that story. Again, I assume that that was done on purpose. Could you tell us why you've done this comeback?
Yeah, I will always look for that loop, to close it off whenever I deliver a presentation. It's not something I will always do, but it's something I will do probably more often than I don't. I think there will be technical reasons for it. For me, it is a tidy way to close off the loop, close off the journey that we've been on, and one of the key things it does is it sends a signal to the audience that this is the end of the journey. We're back where we began, but now we can understand better the point from which we started. For me, that's important, and I think it gives a nice shape to a presentation.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of the old, it's become a bit of a cliche now, and it's not a model I use, but it's similar to it. Tell people what you're going to tell them it, then tell them what you've told them. That's a similar model. So I'm going to talk to you today about why you use stories in your presentations. So here are 3 main reasons you use stories in your presentations. Can you now see how important stories are in your presentations? So you're closing the loop, and it does something very similar.
Yeah. And now you've just said, when you were illustrating this example, okay, I'll give you 3 stories. And that's exactly what you did in that presentation. You didn't tell us 5 stories. You didn't tell us 7 stories. You told us 3 stories. Was there a particular reason why you used the number 3?
Yes, I don't know so much. Yeah, it will be within that presentation as well. That was the right fit for the presentation. In fact, I told you more than 3 stories, because I told you stories in the opening as well. But I presented it as 3 stories in the body of the talk. The body of most of my talks, where I can, I'll use the rule of 3.
Yeah.
2 reasons for that. One, it's easier for the audience to remember and understand the key things we've covered. It gives it a very clear structure. By using 3 stories to illustrate 3 points, I've given you 3 things to recollect. So if I ask you what I've covered in those days, and I tell you there were 3 things, they're probably pretty straightforward to recall. If I give you 7 things or 8 things or 10 things, you're going to really be struggling to come up with that list. About a month ago, I was asked to prepare a sales type pitch as part of a program that I'm delivering. And I prepared it in advance. And then on the day, they said, right, you're all going to do it without notes. And I'll be honest, I hadn't done my homework. I'd prepared it a week before, but I hadn't looked at it since. I was like, So I use mind maps when I prepare my presentation. So I quickly mind map the 8 points. But when I was delivering, I struggled to recall them all, because 8 is too many. But that was the structure that we were given for the presentation. 8 is very difficult. There's no pattern, there's no flow. What I'll tend to do is if I've got 8 or 9 points, I'll try and find the 3 overarching themes, and then have everything come into that as sub points. So I might have a 3, a 3, and a 2, making my 8 points. So for the audience, it's easier to remember, and for me, it's easier to remember. Sometimes I've used 2 groups of 3. So my networking skills presentation that I used to deliver was be courageous, be committed, be patient, pursue the relationship, not the sale. People are interested in people who are interested in them, and ask for what you want. So it's 6 points, but it's 2 batches of 3. Now, I haven't delivered that for quite a while, but I didn't even have to stop and think, because the pattern works. The talk that I've just retired on why we network, it was we network to become better known, better equipped, better connected. My talk on professional relationships looks at building relationships, nurturing relationships, leveraging relationships. So it gives a clear pattern to the audience every time, and it's easy for me to structure things around it and remember it.
It does, yeah. And for our listeners, for those who are not entirely familiar with this. It's very simple concept, but very powerful in communication, the rule of three. Now, another thing, and then I think we can close with the stories, but you didn't just told us stories, you also used emotional stories. So again, could you tell us why you use emotions in your presentations? And sorry, I should also say that there was a presentation about networking, asking for help. It was, in a way, it could be considered as a business presentation, but still you used emotions.
It's interesting because that presentation and that topic is the most emotional that I've delivered, because it's about vulnerability and being open to being vulnerable. And it includes suicide attempts and it includes long-term disability. And so it's going to be emotional by its very nature. But do I bring out the emotion? Of course, because that engages the audience. If we feel something, it will resonate more strongly with us and we'll learn from it. If we feel, we relate. And if we relate, we take away. In my other presentations, I probably don't use as emotional stories that are as emotional. They do illustrate a point more. But the emotion that I'll use more in those stories is humour. Now, whether humour is an emotion or happiness or laughter is the emotion, I don't know. But I'll use humour as the tool to engage people. So I'll try and find the humour in the stories. I'll try and bring that out a little bit more. But you need to find some mechanism through which you can engage your audience and get them on side.
Yeah,
Get them
and actually,
what you're saying.
It was one of the other questions I wanted to ask you. I also remember that you were very good at using humor in your presentation. Now, for those who, because it happens to me so much, I help professionals improve their presentations, and they ask me, I would love to be able to use humor more and better when I give my talks, but I'm not a funny person. Do you have anything you do, any tips, any pieces of advice for those who would like to use humor more and better, but they are not, or they think they're not funny by nature, by definition?
Yeah, the first piece of advice is one that's frequently shared by friends of mine, Jeremy Nicholas, who specialises in using humour in presentations, and Alan Stevens, with whom I work on my talks, and that is never try and tell a joke. And I think that's really important. This isn't stand-up comedy. So if you try and tell a joke, you're setting yourself up for a fall. And that relates to my second tip. And my second tip is, if people don't laugh, they didn't realize it was a joke. And so you just move on. So for example, I have a story, a little vignette about a time I went to an expo for the football industry. And this is an example of how I use humor. So I'll put a throwaway line in, and I've come up with a lot of them in the moment, and I'll know from reactions which should stay in and which shouldn't. And sometimes it's not the one I think is funny. There are lines that I use time and time again, and I never found them funny, but audiences always do. So I leave them in. And there are others that I find really funny and no one ever laughs. They come out. So you can't be too attached. But back to this point. So the line I have there, and it's not it's not an earth-shattering, it's not the world's funniest joke, but it works, is the expo I'm talking about is one for the football industry. So the line is, all the world's leading football clubs tend to go. I'd say Bayern Munich are there, Real Madrid are there, Charlton Athletic. So Charlton being my team. Now, people who like football will get that, and they'll laugh and they'll barrack or whatever. Sometimes audiences don't get it at all, and they don't laugh. And that's fine by me, because that tells me they believe Charlton Athletic are one of the world's leading clubs. So it's okay, carry on. But that's the key point. I haven't put a flag up and said, here comes the punchline. I've just thrown it in naturally, maybe with a bit of a pause, but I've thrown it in quite naturally. And then a little pause after to allow people to process it and laugh if they want to, but not too much, and not, oh my God, why aren't you laughing?
Yeah.
So the more subtle your lines, the easier it is if they don't quite land. And then what you do is you try stuff. And you listen and you pay attention to the audience, and maybe listen back or watch back a recording, and start to notice which lines work and which lines don't, and adapt accordingly. And don't be too precious about anything. But it's about finding those little lines of humor. Nothing major. You're not there as a stand-up comedian. It's finding those little throwaway touches that just draw people in, and then you can move on. The biggest line that I don't find funny at all, by the way, but everyone laughs at, was when I was doing a lot of networking skills presentations. I would say, if you see people on their own, go up and introduce yourself. So you walk up and you say, "Hi, can I join you? My name's Andy, but I recommend you use your own name, otherwise you'll confuse them." I don't find that funny.
But people laugh, yeah?
People laugh, so I keep it in.
Yeah, and you do all of these things to make your talks more engaging. And I remember something else you did that to me was engaging. I was part of the audience. You started the presentation. We arrived and we all had, I don't know whether you still do as part of this talk, but we all had I think it was two pieces of paper. One was green, one was red. And then you started by asking some questions, and we had to put it up either green or red, depending on our answer. Why did you do that as part of your introduction instead of just asking some questions?
It was something that I had to come up with because there was a breakout I used in a lot of presentations that took about 15, 20 minutes. And I wanted to get a similar point across, but I didn't have 15 minutes. So I spoke to a lady called Jackie Barry, who, if you haven't had Jackie on, would be great. Jackie is brilliant when it comes to engaging audiences with games and icebreakers and things like that. And I said,
sorry to cut you off. This is Jackie's surname?
Barry, Barrie.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's JackieBarry.com, Jackie with an IE as well.
Okay.
And Jackie's a specialist in icebreakers. And I said to Jackie, I need to find a different way to engage people more quickly. So what I used to do was, I still do it where I have the time, run a mini mastermind group where everyone in the audience would break into groups of 6 or 7. Someone in that group would have a challenge, and I would give them a structure for the rest of the group to find solutions. And that takes time. It's a 5-minute mini mastermind, but by the time you've set it up and you've got the feedback, you're looking at 15 minutes. And the point I want to make is that we're not alone, and the answers we want are all around us. And Jackie's idea was the red and green cards, and it was 3 statements. So I struggle with managing my time effectively, might be one. I struggle getting heard at meetings is often another. I'm not quite sure where my career is going in the next 5 years is another. And then you hold up the red card if you're struggling with that, and the green card if you've struggled with it in the past, but you overcame it. And both cards if you've been through it, found a solution, and you're back there again. I
remember lots of hands like this.
And that's another line that gets a laugh. You know, it's just a throwaway line. You get a sea of red and green. Now, what that does, rather than put hands in the air, you've got a very strong, powerful visual for the room. People will feel involved. So even if it's a 30-minute or 45-minute talk, you're bringing people in for a moment so they're involved in the conversation, but you're not taking up a huge amount of time in doing it. It's very visual. It's very powerful. Hands in the air is not going to have the same power as red and green cards. A byproduct of it is that I find that it's fantastic for the organisers' video and photography for the event, because particularly with a large audience, you have a very powerful image. And it shows something else. It shows audience interaction and engagement from that perspective as well. That's a byproduct of it, but it's worked really well for me.
Very clever. And you also said now that this gives you as a result also something which is very visual. And connected to this, your visuals, your slides Another thing I liked very much, which was different, and it is different compared to 99% of presentations we see every day. You had very few slides, but apart from that, they were very, very visual. Just maybe just an image, maybe just a few words, or maybe not even a word, I don't remember now, but very visual. Could you please tell us why that approach to presentation design works better?
Yeah, I read a book by a guy called Lee Jackson called PowerPoint Surgery. Lee doesn't focus so much on PowerPoint these days, but the message stands. And the message was, I think out of everything, the biggest message for me from that book was you give your audience a choice. Do they listen or do they read? Do they engage with you or do they engage with the screen? So the screen is there to complement what you do, not to compete with you for attention. So long bullet point lists, graphs with lots of detail, all of these things detract from the presentation. The slides that you saw, there was one detailed slide. It was a joke slide, like the wheel of life that coaches use. It was the emoticon wheel, and it was how British people respond to different situations. And it just said, fine, thanks, fine, thanks, fine, thanks, 150 times or whatever it is in every segment. So you didn't actually have to study. You got the joke pretty quickly, but that was the most detailed slides. When I told the story, I had an image of the person whose story I was telling. At the end of the story, I shared a quote from them that came onto the image. And that was pretty much the presentation. So I had a backdrop and then a key point coming out in a quote, and I kept those quotes really short. So that was the first time I delivered that talk, so I actually had to go back and read the quotes because I couldn't fit the whole quote on the slides because I wanted to keep it tight. Yeah, for me it's about not complementing, not competing would be the key thing there.
Yeah, you're right, people can't read and listen at the same time, but it's still fascinating, if you want, so surprising for me to see that. Isn't that true? Most presentations, from a visual perspective, they're still full of text and bullet points. Most people don't seem not to get it.
And one of the other things I learned from Lee's book was about bleeding the image. So what you'll see in a lot of presentations, and what I was doing before, was putting a photo onto the slide, but it would be surrounded by white space and the logo and the Twitter handle and the copyright and so on and so forth. Now I bleed the image. So if it's an image-led slides, which most of my slides will be, it will go beyond the actual parameters of the slide itself. So it takes the whole space.
Very powerful.
Has a bigger impact. And I've forgone putting my social media handle on every slide because I don't want to detract from the impact the slide should make.
Yeah. And also, another thing I noticed, you were either the only speaker in that conference, or I think there was another one, but most of the others didn't do that, who presented not from behind the lectern. There was a lectern on stage there, and everybody presented from behind the lectern, whereas you were there with us on stage, very close to the audience. Could you tell us why you made that choice?
Yeah, I don't want a barrier between me and the audience. You know, it's a nice, comfortable place, and if you're unsure, you can put your notes on it and so forth. But it serves as a barrier between you and the audience. If you really want to truly engage with people, you lose those barriers. I'll often, depending on the room layout, if it's a smaller room that's got a small stage at the front, I won't stand on the stage. I'll come and I'll be close to the front row. And that's not ideal. I'm not the tallest guy in the world, so there is a trade-off. I've got to recognise if it's a bigger room, everyone's got to be able to see me. You know, it's easier if you're 6 foot plus to just come off the lectern, but I try and be aware of that, but I hate to feel confined. And I hate to, you know, some of these rooms you'll end up with a platform at the front and then a long space before the first row. And that, even if there's no physical barrier, that space is a barrier to me as well. So if it's a big event with a big conference and a big stage, that's different. You need to be on the stage. Yeah. But where I can, I come into the audience.
And what would you say to those who say, look, I get it. I understand that it's not ideal to present from a lectern because it's a barrier, but I don't feel comfortable stepping out of that lectern and getting close to my audience. Do you have any ideas or thoughts or advice that you would share with them?
The first time you swam, you probably didn't feel comfortable either. The first time you presented, you didn't feel comfortable either. The first time you present without notes, you don't feel comfortable. The first time you drive a car, you don't feel comfortable. Practice makes perfect. So challenge yourself. Even if it's know a certain part of your presentation, maybe the close. So that if you feel that you need to be at the lectern for most of it because you've got to have those notes in front of you, then remember the close and then come away from the lectern and try it. And even if it's 2 or 3 steps, and then just ease your way in. You start at the shallow end before you start swimming lengths.
I like it. Are you a learner or an improviser? And what I mean by that is, of course, it's, for us, the way I see it, it's a spectrum. So you have those who feel more comfortable with more freedom on stage, and you have those for whom the very idea of getting up in front of an audience without knowing exactly what to say and when makes them feel very stressed. And it's a spectrum. For example, I tend to, I like to have a structure. It doesn't mean that I need to memorize. I don't want to have a script word for word, but I like to have a very clear structure. But I know that some people, they just want to have maybe 3 key points in their mind and they want to improvise a little bit. I'm just curious, where are you in this spectrum?
Same as you, probably. I mind map my talks. I very, very, very rarely script them. And even when I script them, I then break that down into a mind map. And we talked about the rule of 3 earlier. I try and break them down into 3 points, and off of each of those 3 points, there might be 3 points, so that the mind map and the structure help me remember my journey. Now, I then like freedom within those confines. And that's another reason I don't like a lot of slides, because if you have a lot of slides, you've got less flexibility to go off at a tangent or to change the order. I delivered a brand new presentation in January, and I found myself changing the order of things, which I couldn't have done if I was more dependent on slides. I did have a presentation, but it was limited, so I could change things around a lot more. So I have a mind map. I know where I'm going to go, but I'll then riff. And the more you deliver a presentation, the more it will feel the same, because you know what stories work, you know what humor works, you know where the pauses are. At the beginning, it's slightly different to that, but I still find that even if I feel I've delivered the same presentation, others don't. I remember years ago, I delivered the same presentation twice in Birmingham. Once to a group of, I think it was a junior chamber of commerce, and one of the people there asked myself and my colleague, who was also speaking, to come and do the same 2 presentations to a group of young lawyers that she was involved with. And I said to her after the second presentation, was that okay? And she said it was exactly the same as the first. Yet it wasn't. There were different stories and so on. So sometimes you feel it's the same, but the audience gets something different. No, sorry, I got that wrong. She said it was completely different. I knew I told the same thing. She said it was completely different to the first time. And I might have changed a couple of stories, but she'd have taken different things away. I might put a different emphasis on things. And I often bring in something even that's happened that day. The talk I mentioned before, where I changed the order of things, where it's the first time I delivered it, it was at a big conference, and the opening keynote speaker was talking about something in particular, and one of her main points was very relevant to what I was speaking about. So I was talking about the power of professional relationships, and she was talking about how this huge events organization made their events sustainable. And her second point of 3, she had 3 main points. Her second point of 3 was the power of collaboration. She listed through the talk all of the different partners and stakeholders that they needed to work with in order to make their events sustainable. So as soon as I had the chance, I ran out of the room, I got to my slide deck, and I created a new slide. And I listed all of the stakeholders that she mentioned. And then with animations at the end, after I'd listed them, I pop up on screen a quote from her presentation that morning.
Wow.
Where she said, if you have your partners on board, you multiply your impact. And I put that as a quote with her name afterwards. And I scrapped my opening and I made that the opening to my talk. And that's now the opening to my presentation. So the ability to adapt is key. And if I was too scripted, I couldn't have done that.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's very powerful. I can imagine being there as a member of the audience. I would have certainly said, wow, this guy is just taken something from they've just heard a few minutes ago and he's done his homework, and very interesting.
I would hope so, because they were all event organizers.
Okay. Also, you mentioned, and I think it was already clear based on what you said, but just for those who don't know what a mind map is, could you please quickly tell us what it is?
Yeah, it's a shame I haven't got one to hand that I could just show you, but mind mapping was invented by Tony Buzan, and it's a way of organizing information so that the brain takes it in. Put very simply, I map out my talk, and there is lots of software out there. I use NovaMind. Mind Manager is a very famous one, but there are many mind mapping software tools out there. Most of them will let you have a free level where you can learn it and start playing with it. So the way I use it is I organize my talk clockwise going around a page, and so I will start with my opening. And in the top right hand corner, and I'm hoping that's the top right hand corner of your screen, I will then branch. So I'll put my main point and then I'll put branches coming off of it. Then I'll have my next point and I'll have my main point and branches coming off of it, and then I move around the page. So I effectively my talk goes around a clock face, and it's just bullet points of the key points. Now I've been on mind mapping courses. I know that I don't mind map with the intensity and technically to the level that a lot of people will do who really invest in mind mapping. But the way I do it really works for me. I mind map my talks. I mind map my books. I'll mind map complicated articles. I'll mind map my business strategy. So one of the things I'm doing this afternoon is I'm working on a new customer process for my business, and I use mind mapping to do that as well. So it's not just for talks, but it's very powerful for talks.
Yeah, interesting. No, I also use mind maps for my talks. I've never used it in other areas of my professional projects. So yeah, something for me to consider.
It's a great way to organize your thoughts. It really works.
True. Another thing, Andy, you also talked about briefly before. You mentioned a few times the audience. And actually, before our conversation, before hitting record, the key question, also before today, but you wanted to understand who the audience was for this conversation. Now, one thing that you did that I still remember, which I appreciated a lot in that talk, was you, from time to time, you kept making references to mentoring and business mentoring. And there was an event organized by the Association of Business Mentors. Most people in the audience were business mentors. So you made these references. So you made it relevant to them. Now, could you tell us why you do this? Why is this important? And also, if you have any other examples, or in general, how do you go about making your presentations relevant to that particular audience?
The depth will vary. The reason I do it is I want people to think I'm talking to them. I don't want people to feel that they're getting an off-the-shelf talk that they could just watch on YouTube. But it's relevant to them and that I understand them. Because if I don't feel that you understand me, you know what my challenges are, then why should I listen to you? So I want to invest in the audience. Where I'm maybe keynoting at an industry conference, I will go off and research that industry. So to give you a couple of examples, I gave a talk for Wella, the hair products company, which I always think is quite ironic.
Look at me.
And the person speaking after me was Sir Clive Woodward, who's also follically challenged, and we had a photo together in front of the Weller logo, and I thought, was that in their marketing? But I gave a talk for Weller. Now, I know nothing about the hairdressing industry, so what I did, I insist on a briefing with a client, found out what they wanted to achieve from the talk and their perspective. And then the talk was for 200 of the leading hairdressers in the UK who use Weller products. So I got them to introduce me to 5 of those hairdressers. I sent them out a brief questionnaire, and then I had a phone call with them to understand how my material would be relevant in their world. And talk about the slides. The slides included their tweets, their campaigns, so it was their stories. Another example, I spoke for the Relocation Agents Network, which is a network of estate agents. So what I did, I was referred by one of the estate agents who'd seen me speak elsewhere. I spent a half a day at their office. I talked to the team members. I understood what they did well, what their strengths were, and I took some of their examples. And in fact, they had a real star performer who was brilliant at generating new business through her network. So I had, and I got her permission first, I had a slide that was her face and then her 8 top tips coming out in speech bubbles. So I made her the star. I have a client, the British Boarding Schools Network, and I'm very proud of this one. I've spoken for them a couple of conferences, and I've done a video series for them as well. And I remember my client, Suzanne, saying to me after the first one that she had members come up and say, "What do you mean he doesn't work in education?" And all I had to do was have a basic understanding. My opening line was that you're facing competition from countries like Ireland and Malta, which you haven't before. Now, you and I probably wouldn't know that normally, but everyone in that industry does. And it's just knowing those little things that make a difference. Now, I won't always go to those depths. Those clients paid me a good fee. You know, people say, you get paid how much for 40 minutes? The point is, it's not for 40 minutes. It's for 20 years of experience, and it's for that work that I do in advance that makes that difference. But even when there's not a fee, or when it's a lower fee, I want to know who the audience is. So more recently, I gave a talk for a group of financial directors and ambassadors for a private equity firm. I looked at everyone's LinkedIn profile before I went in the room. And that told me the level at which they were operating. And it told me that I can't talk to them at a very basic level. And I had to acknowledge that, because what I teach is simple. Yeah. It is basic. It's stuff that everyone knows. The difference is we don't implement it. And if I don't acknowledge that with an audience who are operating at a high level, you know, I had a very senior government advisor in that room. Now, you don't get to the level he has without building strong professional relationships. So from the very beginning, I said, look, I've looked at your LinkedIn profiles. I know what you've achieved in your career. I'm not going to teach you anything new. I want to shine a spotlight on what you do, and let's try and identify what works really well, what you've maybe let go, and also how you can replicate what you do so well and teach your teams. So it's by doing that small amount of research before, I could get them to think, I could get them on my side. The alternative would be to stand there and have them sitting there like this, thinking, he doesn't know me, I know all this stuff. So I need to disarm the audience.
And that makes a huge difference. One of the things I also noticed in that particular talk, let's say from a delivery perspective, the way you move on stage, eye contact, gestures, body language is all very natural and effective. Again, do you have any, and I know that it can be maybe too broad of a question, and if it doesn't lead anywhere, we can skip it, no problem at all. But do you have any tips or ideas to share when it comes to movement on stage and eye contact and this kind of delivery techniques?
I'll give you a couple of tips. The first is about one of the common questions: what do I do with my hands? I get compared a little bit to Tony Blair because I'm using my hands like this. But I stopped worrying about it. You know, there's all these rules. Don't have your hands in your pocket. I talk with my hands in my pocket. Not the whole time, but I have put my hand in my pocket while I talk. Don't wave your hands about too much. Sometimes I'll use my hands. The advice that really resonated with me, and it was years ago, and I can't remember who said it, but they simply said, when you get out of bed in the morning, do you tell your hands what to do? And of course you don't. And as soon as you start telling parts of your body what to do, you lose authenticity. So just be natural. You know, the feedback I get probably most frequently and that I'm most proud of is people feel like they've been in a conversation with me rather than it being a presentation. And that comes from being natural. So that would be my first tip. Just be yourself and don't worry. The nerves will tie up your hands a little bit, but I do think initially there are techniques you can use to tell your hands what to do. But if you really want to master this, my belief is be natural. The eye contact, the best advice I had, and again, I only needed to apply this for a short time, and now I don't even think about this. But when I struggled with it, and particularly when you start out, if you do make eye contact, what you do is you draw energy from people who are making really strong eye contact with you, and you get put off by people who avoid eye contact. And it's great to draw that energy, but it's dangerous because you can end up focusing on the same people and excluding the rest of the room. So the technique I was taught was the WM technique. And that is with your eyes, and the larger the audience, the easier this becomes. You follow a W and M pattern. So you look up to the back of the room, down to the front, up to the back, down to the front, and then come back the other way. Now, don't do it too robotically. The pattern to start mixing it up, but it forces you to start looking at different parts of the room. I remember when I was about 16, 17, 18, and I must have been 18, and I'd gone to a recruitment consultancy to get a temp job. And the first thing they said to me was about my handshake, and the second thing they said was about eye contact. And what they said about eye contact was that if you struggle with making direct eye contact, if you look at the bridge of someone's nose, they feel like they're looking at you in the eye. And with an audience, it's similar. You don't have to make direct eye contact. You can look in the general direction and people will feel that you're engaging with them. As you get to bigger talks, you get to a stage where you can't actually see the audience. They're in complete blackness. You've got a spotlight on you. You can't see beyond that spotlight. I remember doing this at the Hackney Empire, a very famous big theatre, holds about 1,000, 1,200 people in the East End of London. And I walked out on stage and I was stunned for a second because I couldn't see a thing. It was completely black. But there are 3 tiers at the Hackney Empire, maybe 4. And I remembered to look up where each in my mind would be. Even though I can't see them, they can see that I'm looking in their direction, and that's all they need.
Very useful. Andy, before we wrap up, are there any, thinking about communication, presentations, public speaking, any books or resources or articles or maybe people to follow that might be beneficial for our listeners to know about?
Now you're throwing me right off the top of my head. I don't want to miss anyone out. But I have to start with my second book.
Sure.
And I can do that because I didn't write the piece on presentation skills. So it's called And Death Came Third. And it's the definitive guide to networking and speaking in public. And Peter Roper, who's the person who I did the double act in Birmingham that I mentioned, I did that with. That was the origins of And Death Came Third. Peter wrote the second half of the book, which is How to Speak in Public. And I think it's a very good introduction to public speaking. So it's not as much for seasoned professional speakers. It's for, as Peter would put it, the charity worker who's being asked to say thank you for, receiving the check, people who are being asked for the first time to go and do it. How do you deal with your nerves? Peter has a system for doing that. So I'd recommend that. And the first half of the book's pretty good as well.
I'm sure it is.
The Presentation Coach, if I remember rightly, by Graham Davis, is an excellent book on professional speaking. The Exceptional Speaker by, I think, Alan Stevens and Paul Dutoit. I can never remember how to pronounce Paul's name, so let's hope he doesn't watch this video, because it's really embarrassing. But Alan and Paul's book is excellent, and I would look at Alan Stevens' books on Amazon. He's written a number of books on the topic. I mentioned Jeremy Nicholas earlier for humour. He runs masterclasses on injecting humour into your talk. So if that's specifically what you're looking for, then talk to Jem about that. So that's Jeremy Nicholas. It's a challenge because there are a number of people who do it. Great coaches other than yourself, of course. I've mentioned Alan and Jem, David Thomas, Paul McGee. Paul McGee is one of the best speakers in the UK, and he runs a presentation skills masterclass once or twice a year. And I had the fortune to go along to that, and it was very good as well. Apologies to anyone I have forgotten. I should say there's you mentioned storytelling. Doug Stevenson is the American master of storytelling. His book Never Be Boring Again is a bit of a Bible on that topic as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, there are going to be others, and they're all behind me.
I can see it. No, but thank you very much. That I'm sure is super useful to our listeners. Andy, thank you so much. It's been fun. Before we close, is there perhaps anything else that you would like to share with our audience? Any ideas, any insights, anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of things. I think the first thing is just enjoy it. We haven't really touched on nerves, and obviously that's one of the biggest drawbacks to public speaking is the nerves element. I don't know if it helps, but just in case it helps, I get really nervous. And Andrea, I don't know if I told you now that I was very nervous before the talk you saw, would you believe that?
I'm sure that's the case, but I didn't see it.
You wouldn't see it. So everyone gets nervous, and that's fine. It's good. It sharpens you. So it's learning to channel those nerves and enjoy it, because once you get past that opening point, and the nerves settle down, it's a fantastic experience when you really engage with people. The best advice I ever had on nerves came from Peter Roper, who I mentioned earlier. I'd given a talk at Earl's Court very early in my career. It was one of these expos in a breakout room where everyone's already sitting there. No one gives you an intro. The guy before me, who was a TV celebrity, had overrun. The room was packed. I came in, he came off the stage. I went and I unpacked the talk, the little the stuff I had to help me in the talk, and I was sort of head down below the sound desk on the stage. And I put my head up, I was ready, and everyone was just staring at me. And I froze. I completely froze, and I didn't know what to do. And I mentioned this to Peter afterwards, and he said, always know your opening. If you know your opening, you then get beyond the nerves. So actually, where I changed the opening a couple of months ago, where I mentioned to you earlier, after the opening speaker, that was a big gamble.
Yeah.
Because I will not change my opening. I knew that would work. And I knew it was right. Because it was a new talk, I could play with that. But once you know it, that's where you get over your nerves. Because if you stand and you're like the deer in the spotlights, as I was at that stage, that's where you reach for. And it pulls you back into the moment. So that would be my biggest piece of advice on nerves. And the other thing is, please don't listen to Coldplay. Don't encourage them. Don't encourage them. Don't feed the beast of terrible music, and listen to something so much better than that. And you see what I did there, bringing something from the very beginning to the very end.
True. And also perhaps one thing from my side, eat a lot of chocolate, truffle tart, yeah?
Only with proper dark chocolate. Over 70%. It has to be over 70%.
Fantastic. Andy, thank you so much again. It's been fun. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.